Sony A6600. This is Sony's newest flagship APS-C camera, basically replacing the A6500. The A6600 is a combination of 6 years of research, experience, and customer feedback that Sony has received since the launch of A6000, and although they have stubbornly kept the overall same design, a lot of small changes have been made. So, is it any good? Compared to its younger brother, the A6400, it costs $500 more at $1,400, which might sound like a lot for a crop sensor camera, but for that, you're getting in-body stabilization and a much bigger battery, which may be the A6600's biggest selling point in this price range because currently, the only other APS-C competitor that can offer both IBIS and comparable battery life is the Fuji X-T4, which hasn't started shipping yet at the time of recording this, and that camera will cost $300 more than the A6600. Also, unlike the A6400, the A6600 gains a headphone jack, which a lot of pro video shooters might appreciate, and because of the bigger battery, the grip size has been increased quite a bit. The grip actually feels closer to the A7 III's more than any other A6000 series cameras, which I'm still not a huge fan of, but grip sizes and shapes are subjective, so just try it out in person before buying it if you have bigger hands. The body feels quite robust and rugged, and the buttons and dials feel pretty nice as well. It's actually 100 grams heavier than the A6400, and I think Sony did a good job making this camera feel more pro and premium than the rest of the A6000 series. But if that was their goal, I do wish they would have added a few more features like dual card slots, or at least the UHS-2, more on that later, or another dial at the front of the grip like on the A7 III, even if that means making the body even bigger. Right now, you have to control all shutter speed, aperture, and ISO with your thumb because the whole front of the grip is pretty much wasted. But if you're upgrading from another A6000 series camera, you're probably used to that. They also got rid of the pop-up flash. I normally don't use onboard flashes on cameras, but I do like these spring-loaded flashes that you can flip back to bounce off the ceiling. And this is just a purely aesthetic thing, but the back of the camera just seems very busy compared to the rest of the camera. I think that could have either used smaller fonts or different colors to group which texts and icons go with which buttons and dials. Compared to cameras from other manufacturers, you can see how this might be a bit daunting to new users. The nicest way to put this, I think, is that it's very Japanese, although they are all Japanese. The rear screen has a pretty reasonable resolution for its size at 921,600 dots, or 1280 by 720. The 16:9 ratio screen is fine for video, but for shooting stills, it does feel a bit small. But then there's always the viewfinder, which is not as big or high-res as Fuji X-T3's at 2.3 million dots, but it looks just fine to me. By now, it's no news to anybody, and there's not even any point mentioning that Sony's menu system is extremely confusing. But like with anything, you can get used to it after a while, and you can also spend some time to customize it with My Menu to make things easier to find. One thing I still don't understand is why Sony is so reluctant on enabling touch for their menu. The screen is already a touchscreen. They didn't even really need to redesign the UI, so what's the holdup? In order for you to navigate to a menu item in a different tab, sometimes you need over 10 or 15 clicks to get there, which normally would have been just 2 or 3 taps with a touchscreen. Speaking of things that remain unchanged, the A6600 uses the same 24 megapixel sensor as its predecessors, so you're not going to see any changes in image quality. I guess it's the classic case of why would you fix something that's not broken, but that also means you can get the same image quality with the A6100, which costs $800 less, along with the same frame rate at 11 FPS, the same number of phase and contrast AF points, and the same UHS-1 slot. Yes, the A6600 still has a UHS-1 card slot, which is fine for most people, but strangely, it has much smaller buffer than the camera it's replacing, the A6500. The A6500 could shoot over 100 RAWs or 300 JPEGs, but the new A6600's buffer gets filled with less than half of that amount at 46 RAWs or 116 JPEGs. And still, yet again, you can't access most of the menu items while the buffer is clearing up, which is pretty annoying, and it takes about 25 seconds to clear 46 RAW files. And just in case you're curious, this is what it feels like. The 24 megapixel sensor was a great sensor a few years ago and still is one of the best APS-C sensors on the market, but the competition has gotten very close. Compared to the brand new sensor on the Canon M6 Mark II, which came out around the same time, it still has better dynamic range, but the differences are not as noticeable anymore as they were with some of the older Canon sensors. Recovering the shadows 5 stops, the differences are very subtle, but the Sony images did retain a bit more detail, as you can see under the roof here. While recovering the highlights, the results were more obvious. I mean, if you're having to constantly edit your photos like this, you're obviously not doing this right, but it might become useful one day. Low light images are pretty much identical up to ISO 12800, and then just when you get up to ISO 25600, the Sony's image shows a bit less noise. Unlike the Canon sensor, the native ISO also goes up to 32000, then the images seem more comparable. But you have to remember that the Canon sensor has 8.5 more megapixels, so you're gonna see a bit more detail in your images in most situations as long as you have a good lens. Which brings me to my next point, the lenses. Sony has been slowly but constantly growing their mirrorless lens offerings over the past 6 or 7 years, and in the past that was one of the biggest complaints that most people had about Sony, but obviously no one's concerned about that now. And also because unlike the Canon mirrorless system, Sony's APS-C and full-frame mirrorless cameras share the same lens mount, so if your goal is to eventually upgrade to full-frame, it can be a lot easier for you and your wallet. In terms of video, you can internally shoot 8-bit 4K up to 30 frames per second and 1080p up to 120 frames per second. And the 4K quality is great and there are lots of customizable options if you need, but again, the image quality hasn't really changed from the previous models. Which also means there's horrendous rolling shutter in 4K like the older models did, but now it can do eye tracking in video, not just face tracking. There's one thing that Canon could do before Sony could, but one thing that Canon still doesn't have is IBIS. When I tested the A7 III, I was a bit disappointed about the performance of its IBIS. And although the A6600's stabilization is still not exactly at GH5 or GoPro level, for normal handheld shooting, I think it's pretty decent. With the A7 III, I really couldn't even tell if it was even there or not, but with this, I can at least tell that it's working. And now back to the biggest reason to buy the A6600 instead of any other A6000 series cameras, the battery. I personally don't know any professional photographers who use the A6000 series cameras as their daily drivers, but I know a lot of professional video shooters who use A6000 series cameras, and if that's you, I think you're going to enjoy the A6600 a lot more. Not only is the battery bigger, there's also no recording limit as well. When I tested the M6 Mark II last week, it could shoot about 4 30-minute 1080p clips before the battery died. The A6600 kept going well over 3 hours until my 64GB memory card was full, and then it still had 13% battery left. While shooting 4K, unfortunately the camera overheated after an hour and 20 minutes, but still that was one full video. Even wedding ceremonies don't last that long nowadays. So, back to the good old question, should you buy one? Well, if you're a hobbyist or a casual photographer, I think the A6400 might be a better value for you unless you just really don't like carrying extra batteries. You don't always need IBIS for photos, and you also get the pop-up flash with the A6400. For video or hybrid shooters, I think the A6600 is a much easier sell. To be honest, even for me, this is a bit of an overkill as a video camera, but I would personally go for this instead of the A6400 just for the IBIS and the battery life. The IBIS, although not perfect, is still a great addition, and the battery life for video, it is the difference between having to constantly check the camera knowing it's gonna die at any moment and just turning on the camera and forgetting about it. To summarize, this is far from a perfect camera, but no camera is perfect. Is this the best camera for the price? It depends, but at least to a lot of people, I think it might be. If you try to look for things that are wrong with it, then you'll find them. But if you're just focused on shooting good pictures and videos, there's a lot more things on this camera that can help you rather than hold you back. So for that reason, I highly recommend it.